And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, our very own Miles Osgood, yay! Who is, as you know, our lecturer for SLE first year, and he got his PhD from Harvard in English and did his undergrad at Stanford also. He's currently writing a book on world literature, international sport, and Olympic art competitions of 1912 to 1948. And that book project also involves a digital humanities portion as well, an online digital humanities project. He has taught many classes on modernism, Ulysses, modernist women writers, and global short fiction. He also does a lot of public humanities and public writing in Washington Post, and he's written, you've written about in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Miles, too. Mm-hmm. That's cool.
Yeah, while
nice. I was humanities advocacy, and we all need that. So yeah, so welcome, Miles, and thank you. He's going to talk to us today about avant-garde manifestos. Hey.
Great. All right, let me set this up. I'm going to share this and play, and let's see if that works. Are you seeing my title slide?
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter mode. Miles, presenter mode. Do a swap.
No secrets. Okay. Perfect. So I want to start this presentation with 3 items. The first of which will be familiar: museums, cemeteries. This is a quote from the Futurist Manifesto. It's kind of in the format of a bad joke. Museums, more like cemeteries. The second item is the most famous futurist artwork to emerge from this movement, Umberto Boccioni's Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, which makes good on the manifesto's promise of glorifying and representing speed and dynamism and mechanism. It's a beautiful sculpture that kind of has its own vapor trails. And the third item I want to present you with is Unique Forms of Continuity in Space in a Museum. So I think this poses us with a question. And that question is, how did Futurism, the enemy of museums, end up in a museum? And how did the avant-garde in general end up in a museum if they were once sworn enemies? One way of phrasing this is put in this quote by Peter Berger, who wrote kind of the authoritative work on the avant-garde, theory of the avant-garde. He writes, "The paradox of the failure of the avant-gardes lies without a doubt in their artistic success. The provocation that was supposed to expose the institution of art is recognized by the institution as art." That's the problem. The avant-garde was supposed to expose the institution of art, and then the institution of art instead decided to recognize it as art. A kind of simpler way of formulating this would be to just put it as revolution versus institution. And that's what I'll be talking about today. Novelty against tradition, breaking the rules against making the rules in the realm of art. And I think this might be a relevant question for us in SLE, because when Marinetti asks us the question, do you wish to waste your best strength in this eternal and useless admiration of the past? That's a question we have to answer based on what we've been doing this year. And if we think there's something valuable about studying the past, this is a direct challenge to us. If, on the other hand, we feel more aligned with the revolution side of this struggle, then we need to answer other challenges. The story of the avant-garde is about the ways that revolutions can go wrong and about the comparative resilience of institutions in some cases. So let's back up a little bit and talk about how we got to the avant-garde in the first place. So as you may remember from reading Marx, the 19th century, the century preceding what we're going to be talking about today, is marked by the rise of bourgeois culture. This includes things like the Bildungsroman and the marriage plot novel, the operetta in music, the arts and crafts movement in the arts, and general movements in decorative arts. This is sort of art for the bourgeois family, and art for the bourgeois home. It's commercial art, but it's also art that kind of glorifies a certain middle-class lifestyle and is designed for it in a way. And Marx does not mince his words about what he thinks of this trend in the arts. He says, as of all times, but especially of this time, your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your time, of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property. And that culture, he says in the Communist Manifesto, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine. And I think he means this both for the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That, of course, he's worried about the alienation of the proletariat and the way that culture kind of props that up. But on the other hand, he's also worried that the bourgeois culture just engenders more bourgeois people and more bourgeois types. So this poses a problem for artists who are interested in resisting bourgeois culture, like Marx, who think that art should be about something else. And the artists of the 19th century come up with a few distinct solutions for getting around the sort of power of bourgeois culture around them. The first of these we might call academicism, based as it is sort of around the formation of art academies, which existed before the 19th century and existed after the 19th century, but sort of come into their own and have a particular strength in the 19th century, particularly because they offer artists a way of drawing upon something that is pre-bourgeois, of a sort of classical standard for beauty and the arts. And the slogan of this movement, if one were to find one and take one from the French National Academy, would be something like "To immortality." Let's look for things that are timeless, rather than things that kind of belong to our bourgeois century. A second solution we might call aestheticism. This is directly in resistance to the demand of bourgeois culture that everything be commercial, that everything be for sale. Aestheticism says, what if we just make art that is about art and that is only in dialogue with other artists, and we decide we're not going to care about, how commercially viable it is. And this has a slogan that you may be familiar with, that is art for art's sake. And that's an idea, a concept that really develops in the 19th century. Finally, there's a kind of further fringe group that is comprised of people we might call realists and decadents and symbolists. And for them, they want to be even more out there. So if you thought there was something shocking about the middle painting, as some people did, you were maybe not necessarily prepared for the shock of this last artwork that I'm going to show you. And shock is precisely the point. Here the goal is to kind of take the war directly to the bourgeoisie. And the slogan appropriately is "Shock the bourgeoisie, épater la bourgeoisie." That is the goal of the artists kind of all the way out there. They want to represent, on the one hand, working class culture, and kind of heroicize that, and also look at the ways in which that those lives have been destroyed. But at the same time, they're interested in this kind of conceptual shock and just sort of visceral shock. This painting is both obscene in terms of what it represents for the time, but it's also profane because it's called "The Origin of the World." So it's also making fun of a certain kind of Christian viewpoint. And so what happens in the 20th century is that these movements evolve into terms that we recognize kind of for our own time. The first of these I'm kind of coining as the Old Guard. That's a kind of continuation of this idea that art should depend on schools, on conservatories, on academies, and that should determine the standards of art. Then there's this term modernism that comes from this kind of arts for art's sake idea, and that's something we'll talk about a few weeks from now with Virginia Woolf. And realism and the decadents and the symbolists, they become the avant-garde, which is similarly a splintered set of movements who are all generally committed to this kind of art of conceptual and visceral shock. So now we can start to draw a schema for the 20th century, kind of having looked at sort of what the 19th century looked like. So let's start by kind of defining what the avant-garde is. Well, so literally the term avant-garde means vanguard, and it means the front ranks of a military force. And we'll see as we go along why this military metaphor might be appropriate and might even be more than a metaphor, that this might be a military movement in a certain kind of way. And it's worth noting that some of the first people to use the phrase avant-garde metaphorically were early 19th century socialists that Marx writes about. So there's also a political dimension to this. The avant-garde wants to do more than offend bourgeois sensibilities, like maybe the realists wanted to do. They want to undermine the institutions of bourgeois culture. So in this respect, that means they are at war with other artists. So not just with a bourgeois audience, but with people they perceive as kind of being in league with the bourgeoisie and with certain features of high culture. So this involves a war on at least one front with the Old Guard. And I think the battle between the Old Guard and the Avant-Garde, which I'm representing here with these two artworks, is a way of kind of clarifying what the Avant-Garde is all about. Because they define themselves oppositionally. I think you can see that with Futurism and with Surrealism. It's all about distinguishing each movement from other movements and from other artists. So whereas the Old Guard determines the value of artworks based on academies and juries and prizes, the avant-garde uses public stunts and this idea of a success based on scandal. So on the left, right here, we have a sculpture that is the toilette of Venus, that is the Venus bathing. So we've got kind of a classical ideal, we've got the kind of classical nude, and on the right, we have a literal toilet. We have a urinal that is signed with a false name and photographed and put on a pedestal and then submitted to a gallery with the express purpose of getting it rejected, basically, and then writing an article about how it was rejected. So you're trying to engender scandal. The old guard was interested in excelling within the rules. The avant-garde was invested in breaking the rules of art. The old guard tended to be organized around national institutions and organizations, whereas the avant-garde hung out in cosmopolitan expatriate groups where nationality wasn't really a concern. The old guard, as you can see in this image, is interested in a certain kind of idealism of beauty, whereas the avant-garde likes to court irony and ugliness. The old guard bases its governance structure on constitutions, whereas the avant-garde, as we have seen in the reading this week, uses manifestos in newspapers and magazines. Okay, so that's the avant-garde versus the old guard. And together, this kind of set of avant-garde, modernism, and old guard come to define what we know as the highbrow. Now, that may be a term you've heard, and it's a term that kind of comes from this period. There's a self-consciousness about these artists in terms of figuring out where they fit in the cultural field of their time. So in general, you know, kind of this subset of artists all belong to the highbrow, which is to say that they are distinguished from a middlebrow, from a sort of middle-class artistic taste that belongs to the bourgeoisie. So this is the second war that the avant-garde is fighting. They're fighting a war on one front with the old guard, but they're also fighting a war on another front with the middlebrow. And we can kind of see this distinction with a different set of images. So here are two cups and saucers. One of them you can use to drink with, and one of them you cannot. And the idea here is to poke fun at the idea of decorative art. That art should not be decorative, according to the avant-garde. Art should be provocative. Art is not made to beautify your bourgeois home. It's not made to just hang on the wall or put on the table. It is made to challenge you and make you think. And that is kind of hopefully what this cup in fur, simply titled Object, is going to do for you. It's going to get you to think. So if we go back to our schema, the last piece we have to add, as you might have expected, is the lowbrow, which is to say mass culture and popular culture. That means culture that the bourgeoisie makes for the masses, but also the culture that the masses make for themselves in terms of folk culture and popular culture. And the reason I've laid things out like this is from top to bottom, we go from more complex, more difficult art to kind of more simple, more straightforward art, from the highbrow to the lowbrow. But there's also a kind of important gradient from left to right, which is political. So the avant-garde is radical aesthetically, but it also tends to be more associated with radical politics. We'll see there are some variations within that. The old guard, on the other hand, tends to be more conservative and more invested in aristocratic, republican, imperialist politics. So there's a way of thinking about this on an x-axis and a y-axis. Lest you think I'm making all of this up, all of this schema, there really truly was this thing called the Battle of the Brows that happened in newspapers and on the radio and in letters among artists of this time. And Virginia Woolf kind of makes one of the best statements on this. Virginia Woolf was somebody we would call a modernist. She's kind of in that middle of that highbrow position, but she definitely sees herself as being a highbrow, and she's proud of it. She may even be a little bit snobby about it. That's kind of Virginia Woolf's mode. But she says this great thing in a letter about the Battle of the Brows, which I wanted to quote for you. If any human being, man, woman, dog, cat, or half-crushed worm dares call me middlebrow, I will take my pen and stab him dead. So she is very serious about this. And you might ask, why is Woolf so concerned with being called middlebrow? And this gets us to a feature of the Futurist Manifesto that I'm sure you noticed, which is its blatant and overt and gleeful misogyny. If you think of Marinetti's contempt for women and for feminism, that's something we kind of have to reckon with the existence of the avant-garde. And I think the thing that ties this together, Woolf's anxiety about being called middlebrow and Marinetti's scorn for women, it's an idea inherited from the 19th century, that women artists and especially women audiences belonged to a bourgeois middle brow class, that they were not serious, that they were not high, because, you know, that was their station in society and that's the kind of taste that they had. And so Woolf is very clear to distinguish herself from that. There's another kind of anxiety being represented in the Futurist Manifesto when the Futurists take things out on women, and that's to do with the fact that women are very much at the forefront of the avant-garde right now. So if it were ever true that women were kind of a sort of middle brow class in the 19th century, which I think is very debatable, it's certainly not true in the 20th century. So here we have two instances of women who played really formative roles in the movements we're looking at in Futurism and Surrealism. On the left, we have a manifesto written by Mina Loy, which is a feminist manifesto, and she wrote that in the same year that she wrote Aphorisms on Futurism. So she actually wrote her own Futurist manifesto, and she was a lover of Marinetti's. So you might think that, like, you know, Marinetti protests a little too much by trying to exclude women from his movement when clearly they were there from the early years. They were kind of there from the beginning. There on the right, we see kind of a page from one of André Breton's most important works. So Breton is known, apart from his manifestos, for a novel called Nadia, which involves him traipsing around Paris with a woman who kind of acts as his muse and inspiration for Surrealism itself. She creates these kind of beautiful, odd collages and drawings that we see here, and she comes up with lots of interesting surrealist phrases. And Breton sort of appropriates those, and then when Nadia goes to an insane asylum, Breton comes up with these reasons that he's not going to visit her. And so there's this way in which women contributions to the avant-garde get erased and have only kind of been rediscovered and reclaimed in time. But it's important to know that they are very much part of this highbrow class, but that there's a certain anxiety around male avant-garde artists about thinking that associating with women means associating with the middle brow. And I think that's partly why that's happening, but I think it's worth talking about in our seminars as well. Okay, now we have to transition a little bit to thinking about why the genre of the avant-garde was the manifesto. And I hope as you were reading the manifestos, you were thinking back to the Communist Manifesto, since that's the kind of example we have at hand and really was an influential document in world literature in its own right. Because I think that's the kind of thing that Marinetti and Breton are thinking about. They both start off as socialists. We'll get into that some more. And I think they do have Marx on their minds when they're writing these. So the things they're going to take from Marx are, first of all, an idea that Marx stated in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, that the point of philosophy is not to describe life, but to change it. That's a very easy, that idea is very easy to translate to the arts. The idea for the avant-garde is similar. The idea of art should not be about describing the world. Art should be about changing the world. So there's this notion of praxis, which is to say a kind of practical effect that art is supposed to enact on the world. Then there's this idea that these movements are supposed to be border crossing, that they're supposed to be international movements, and that they're supposed to propagate. So where Marx says workers of the world unite, there's an idea among avant-garde artists that the goal should be to unite a bunch of artists internationally around a single cause. And then the nice thing that the Communist Manifesto offers as a sort of trope is the list of what communism stands for and the communist movement stands for. And you probably noticed that this is also a feature of the Futurist and Surrealist manifestos, and it tends to be a feature of a lot of manifestos. And I put it here that, like, this is kind of the original listicle. It's, you know, 1, we're going to do this, 2, we're going to do this, 3, so forth. And that goes with some of the more lyrical aspects of the manifesto. So in general, manifestos have a kind of political quality to them inherited from Marx as a sort of rallying cry to create a collaborative political party or artistic party. And we see this in particular with Surrealism. And this is why I mentioned, you know, the idea of it being a listicle. Surrealism has generated these kind of web articles like this of sort of like, here are crazy surrealist paintings and here are 5 crazy surrealist games. Because the legacy of Surrealism was the creation of new methods that could then be reused by other people. You could call those methods to boost creativity, But what the Surrealists would call it would be something more like methods of tapping into the unconscious. So you can see Freud come in here, and Breton is very explicit about that. So the Surrealists developed techniques of automatic writing and automatic drawing, where you just kind of let your mind free associate and you create things. And that's what Breton means when he defines Surrealism as psychic automatism. It's sort of letting the hand move automatically to write poems or to compose drawings. But the Surrealists also realize that there's a way of doing this that that relies on the juxtapositions and combinations that people will create collectively. So this collage on the right is created by a number of artists who, pick up the page and then add something and then pass it along. And the most famous example of this is a poetry game called Exquisite Corpse, which we're going to play in a minute. So the way Exquisite Corpse works is somebody writes a phrase, and then they just let that phrase exist in isolation. Usually it's just a few words. And then somebody else picks up where that phrase left off and adds something else, with the hope that we'll sort of get to a kind of associative, unconscious surreality that is beyond what any rational mind could compose or create. And the reason it's called Exquisite Corpse is because that's the most famous instance, that's the kind of most famous poem that originated from this game. So one person wrote the exquisite, the next person wrote corpse, trying in a way to kind of play off this idea of exquisiteness. Then we went from there to will drink. So the exquisite corpse will drink the new wine. And you get this kind of odd phrase that you sit with and think about. So what I want to do now is kind of turn off the show and go back to Zoom, if I can figure that out. Maybe I can't. Let's see.
So Miles, go up to the top of the screen and you should be able to stop sharing.
Oh, thank you.
It should be a little red, no problem.
Yes, great. All right, that's gonna bring me back. All right, so I'm gonna type a phrase into the chat. And in the effort of making SLE more collaborative and a little bit more surreal, I'm going to see how many of the 40 of us can kind of compose one of these poems together. And I'll keep going with the lecture, but you can kind of keep doing this as I'm talking and free associate off things I'm saying. But I'll read it during the questions and answer, and we'll see how we do. So I'll just start with this phrase. You can choose to write this in all caps or not, as you prefer, in the headline style or not. But when the spirit moves you and you see that there's an opening, add something and let it keep going. All right. I'm gonna take us back to the presentation. Do I need to swap displays again?
No, you look great. You look great.
Okay, so back to the Exquisite Corpse. So the other thing that the manifestos were a template for was simply more manifestos. So I've kind of put an array of them here, and what we see on the left is that by 1914, Marinetti, like 5 years after the original Futurist Manifesto, Marinetti could already come out with a book of Futurist manifestos. There would eventually be hundreds of them. And then we would get manifestos of Surrealism, Vorticism, Dada, Cannibalism, Vertov's We Manifesto, New Youth in China, and it really becomes a global phenomenon. You could almost say that the manifesto becomes its own literary genre, and that it is even the content of the avant-garde. It is almost more important than the artworks that the avant-garde creates. And that's kind of why we are reading manifestos in SLE rather than the poems or novels that came out of those manifestos. The manifesto might be the most important kind of literary tradition and innovation to come out of this period. And what's important about that is that these writers take something that was a vehicle for political statement back with Marx, and they turn it into a form of poetry. And that political origin remains relevant because the avant-garde has abandoned the approval of art institutions. So what they're doing is they're looking for legitimacy and power by attaching themselves to political rhetoric and political movements. This is the reason that among all those movements, all those manifestos that I showed you, all those isms, that we focus on Futurism and Surrealism. Because in the 1920s and the 30s, Futurism and Surrealism took their artistic revolutions back into the realm of political revolution. Remember how I was saying that the avant-garde is committed to collective production and collective reception? I guess I kind of glossed over that. There's an idea that sort of this should be a collaborative project. Well, now they're going after a political collective. They're going after the masses. On the futurist side, as you could probably tell from reading the Futurist Manifesto, the emphasis on militarization, on masculinity, on violence, on modernization, on machines, merges with fascist values very easily. In fact, it might even help shape fascism. F.T. Marinetti writes this document that we see on the left that is a fascist manifesto. He co-writes a fascist manifesto in the early days of fascism. And then in the 20s and 30s, futurist artists start to glorify fascism and Mussolini. They become kind of the party's art. They become the sort of in-house artists of the fascists. And then meanwhile, Breton gets more and more invested in Surrealism being a socialist movement. He thinks his aesthetic revolution should be also a political revolution. So he banishes all surrealists in his later manifestos and magazines. He banishes all surrealists who refuse to participate in collective action. And he meets with Trotsky and he corresponds with Stalin. And then with Diego Rivera, he co-writes a manifesto for independent revolutionary art. So the kind of deeper he gets into this movement, the more he thinks it has the potential to kind of shake things up politically. And the cultural critic who most clearly saw what was going on here is this man, Walter Benjamin. In the middle of the 1930s, he writes an essay about the intersection of the arts, modern technology, and politics, titled "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction." And in this essay, Benjamin explains how art has lost its old ritual power that it used to have, the aura around artworks where people would take pilgrimages to see individual artworks in an age of film and photography. And so art now needs to turn to political power instead. And this is kind of repeating what I was saying before with the avant-garde. When the avant-garde runs away from art institutions, it finds its purpose and its power in politics. And the epilogue to this essay of Benjamin's is really fascinating. He argues that fascism and futurism take advantage of the unrest of the masses and a surplus of modern technology and give these forces an expressive outlet. And that expressive outlet is war itself, which leads to kind of a new slogan for the avant-garde, you know, after all those 19th century slogans. And the slogan Benjamin comes up with to describe what's going on is "Fiat ars pereat mundus," let art be created though the world perish. Taking up Marxist terminology, Benjamin is basically arguing that human self-alienation has gotten so far that people can experience their own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure. And you might think right now of Freud's death instinct as something that these artists and these philosophers are reckoning with, especially in relation to Adrian Dabb's commentary on Freud kind of thinking about World War I and fascism, that's something that Benjamin is also doing. Benjamin notices that futurism delights in the atrocities of World War I. Futurism thinks World War I is the culmination of what it started, and that futurism is now delighting in kind of creating that militaristic, mobilized energy again around fascism. But interestingly, Benjamin also sees this as a problem for the modernists and the aestheticists. He has this kind of follow-up line: "This is evidently the consummation of l'art pour l'art, of art for art's sake." So if you remember that phrase from the 19th century kind of schema, what's interesting is that Benjamin kind of recognizes that there has been a certain irresponsibility about certain artists to not politically engage and to not kind of deal with some of the worst impulses of the avant-garde, perhaps. This is something maybe, you know, to think about a little bit in terms of like, what is art's function in the world? Does it need to have a function? Should it have a function? Should it be purely about beauty or purely about art? This is something that kind of troubles Benjamin in this moment. Benjamin then thinks about the split that has occurred politically and artistically in his 30s. Remember, he's writing this in 1936, so this is like really on the cusp of World War II. He writes, "The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. Communism responds by politicizing art." So, you know, to kind of put that in a neat chiasmus, for Benjamin, fascism aestheticizes politics and communism politicizes art. And whether those two things are actually different, I think is something maybe to talk about. I'm not sure that I've totally wrapped my head around it. It's something that you can also now weigh in on because you've seen Battleship Potemkin and Man with a Movie Camera, which are early manifestations of Soviet art. But I actually want to take this in a slightly different direction and look at another movement in the Soviet arts, which is constructivism, which is very much associated with Vertov and with filmmaking, but is also a form that has manifestations in theater and manifestations in the visual arts. So this is kind of the most popular avant-garde in Soviet Russia right after the Bolshevik Revolution. And there is really a flourishing of political avant-garde art as well as abstract art in this time. Russia had already had a futurist movement before the 1917 revolution. That was one of the places where futurism really caught hold. And constructivism followed from that. But curiously, under Stalin, so not that far into the kind of Soviet communist experiment, the arts in Russia take a complete 180. The official communist art style becomes socialist realism, which, as you can see kind of from the contrast of these two images, is very different. Here we have conservative style and very clear, unambiguous content. There's a retreat to a safety in art that only represents positivity and harmony. It doesn't have any ambiguity, doesn't invite any kind of critical thinking. And I think this is an important part of the story as well, is that even though the avant-garde was invested and involved in mass politics, totalitarian regimes that follow from those revolutions usually do away with the avant-garde eventually, because the avant-garde creates and captures the energy of a revolution, but that revolutionary energy is too dangerous to be kept alive for all that long. Insofar as avant-garde artists want to inspire a certain kind of revolutionary thinking in people and in the masses, this is not what the leaders of those people really want in the long run. So we see this in Russia, but we also see this in Germany. So on the left is a picture of Joseph Goebbels, who's the Reich propaganda minister for the Nazis. He shows a certain kind of morbid curiosity for the avant-garde, and especially German expressionism, which is another movement we didn't get a chance to talk about, and says things like, you know, we Nazis, we are not unmodern. But the Third Reich collects all this artwork and exhibits it as degenerate art. So they give it this kind of pejorative label that goes along with sort of what, you know, how degenerates will be treated by the party as a whole, which is to say the artworks are collected, they are moved around the country, they are shown, and then they are ultimately destroyed. And the movement that takes its place is a kind of neoclassicism that we see on the right. So actually the old guard kind of comes back. The old guard has its day under these regimes because the Nazis in this case wanted to kind of create this myth that there was a racial line that went back from ancient Greece to kind of the modern Aryans. And this, you know, in terms of my research, comes up in the 1936 Olympics, and the film that comes out of that, Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia, kind of promotes that idea. But there's all kinds of architecture and sculpture also around that idea. And even in Italy, where the alliance between the political party of fascism and futurism seemed so sure, that alliance eventually dissolves. So Mussolini is sufficiently taken with the kind of classicism of Nazi Germany that he also decides to go in that direction. So gradually he distances the futurists from political power, and then eventually he and the fascists in general kind of decide that they're going to prefer this old guard classical style. And the Italian myth here is that what the fascists are doing are creating a new Roman Empire. They're creating a third Rome after the kind of Roman Catholicism and the Rome of antiquity. This will be the third Rome. So it makes sense to kind of go back to a classical grandeur rather than to keep letting the avant-garde experiment within the wings of power. So we have this futurist artwork on the left and sort of classical artwork on the right, and that marks another transition of kind of what happens in the political arts. And what's really weird about this is that the old alliances that the old guard and the avant-garde made have kind of switched. So the old guard used to rely on the approval of art institutions, but now in the 30s and 40s, it becomes part of the political establishment, which was not kind of its original role or its original interest. The avant-garde, by contrast, which used to want to shape politics, now becomes more respected among art institutions as culture's driving force, and is something that is kind of exists outside of the political realm now that it's kind of been kicked out. So you get this kind of weird inversion where the avant-garde gets now kind of associated with institutions. And this brings us back to the lecture's original question, which was, how did Futurism, which was once the enemy of museums, end up in a museum? Or more broadly, how did the avant-garde and the art institution, which once would have been very strange bedfellows, end up in bed together? So I hope we kind of get into this in the Q&A, but I'm going to offer a few possible answers for this, and then some concluding thoughts on what this might mean for us in this program and, you know, studying the past the way that we are. So one way to think about this image of these kids sitting around this once provocative sculpture and drawing it in MoMA in New York, I think, is to say that the institutions won, that this is an institutional victory. And the argument here would be something like, the avant-garde set out to shock the bourgeoisie, but it turns out the bourgeoisie is not so easily shocked. And the reason that might be, you know, an explanation one might give is to say that, you know, insofar as the bourgeoisie thrives on capitalism, capitalism actually loves novelty, which means it loves innovation and experimentation, and it can totally accept that in the arts, just as it can in commerce. So maybe the avant-garde was actually not so much of a force trying to resist modernity or destroy modern capitalism, so much as it was a manifestation of modern capitalism and modernity, because the avant-garde was relentlessly seeking the new and novelty, and this actually went along very nicely with the kinds of things that the bourgeoisie was interested in. A quote here that strikes me as relevant for what we've been watching and reading this week is by Luis Buñuel, the director of Un Chien Andalou, the movie we all just saw, who was really dismayed by the fact that the bourgeois really ate up his movie. Like the bourgeoisie really loved his movie. Like it wasn't nearly as shocking to them as he was hoping. So he writes this in Breton's Surrealist magazine. He writes, wow, a box office success. What can I do about those who seek every novelty, even if that novelty outrages their most profoundly held convictions? He sort of sees the bourgeoisie as a kind of unsolvable problem, that it's very hard to kind of resist their ability to turn everything into a product and into something acceptable over time. Another way of thinking about this would be to say that in general, the institution demonstrates its strength by embracing its attackers. And that's what the bourgeoisie decides it's going to do as well. So that's one interpretation of what's going on here. The opposite interpretation is to say that maybe this is actually an avant-garde victory, even though there's a certain paradox or a certain irony of Futurism ending up in a museum. The argument here would be that the avant-garde changed the rules of what we value in art, and that the institutions and audiences are just following their lead. So at one time, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, the old guard used to dictate the rules of art, used to dictate what art was important and why art was needed to be beautiful and what standards it needed to reach. But then, you know, as we were looking at that political history, once the old guard got co-opted by totalitarianism, it kind of started to look like old guard values were hollow and empty. And there was a void of sort of like, well, what art are we going to respect as a result? And in the wake of World War II and with the rise of the Cold War, the avant-garde began to look like the art of freedom, the art of individualism, the art of resistance, the art that could save us from totalitarianism, because it had been thrown aside. The quote that I'm going to bring here is back from our friend Peter Berger from the beginning of the presentation. The discourse of the institution, he writes, is molded by the avant-gardes to a degree that no one could have predicted. Avant-garde categories such as rupture and shock gain admittance to the discourse of art, while at the same time concepts such as harmony and coherence are suspected of conveying a false appearance and a reconciliation with a degraded status quo. What I think is interesting about this is it's not just true when you go to MoMA, or it's not just true when you go to a modern art museum. This is true, I think, even when you go now to a museum or a gallery that features things from the Renaissance or from antiquity, or from some historical past, from some other tradition. We have come to think that one of the most important values in art is novelty or innovation or experimentation. So when we look at, a painting by Leonardo da Vinci, we want to know, well, what is he doing differently from the generation that came before him? Like, in what way is he breaking the rules of his time? And I think that idea of valuing art for that reason, valuing art for its newness and its experimentation, is something we inherited from the avant-garde. And in that sense, the avant-garde reshaped the institutions in its own image and according to its own values. There's one more victory, as it were, and I'll put that in air quotes, that I think we need to consider, and it's especially relevant to SLE because we've started with the ancient world and we've worked our way up all the way to the moderns. And the idea is this: it's actually really, really hard to come up with something genuinely new and to leave tradition behind altogether, even for a movement as committed to that principle as the avant-garde. So this time, compared to the slide I began with, I want to put Boccioni's sculpture, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, next to a different quote from the Futurist Manifesto. That quote is this: "A racing car with a hood that glistens, that is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace." Okay, now I'm going to show you the victory of Samothrace. And I think when you see these sculptures together, you can tell that Boccioni has been reading his Marinetti. He's been reading the Futurist Manifesto carefully and thinking about it. And on the one hand, he's definitely trying to create something new. There is something undeniably dynamic and different about his sculpture, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. But he is also paying homage to something very old, to the exact artwork that Marinetti was denigrating in his manifesto. This Unique Forms of Continuity in Space sculpture is quoting from the victory of Samothrace, which is funny. Is it trying to destroy it? Is it trying to overtake it? Maybe, but it's also calling it back to our minds and respecting the beauty, I think, of that old object. And there's a lesson here for us, insofar as Unique Forms of Continuity in Space is the most famous futurist sculpture. And the lesson is that the art that succeeds so much of the time is the art that strikes a balance between the old and the new, between being revolutionary and recognizing tradition. And I want to leave you now with a quote from somebody else of this generation, T.S. Eliot, who has come up a few times in SLE lectures, and who I really encourage you to read if you haven't, because he's a writer who wrote, on the one hand, very radical experimental poetry, and on the other hand, like surprisingly conservative and reactionary essays. So he kind of has this dual existence. And we call him a modernist, I think, partly for that reason, because like Virginia Woolf, say, or like some of the other modernists, he's kind of caught in the middle. And he writes this essay that similarly represents this duality called Tradition and the Individual Talent. And in that essay, he imagines someone saying to him, "The dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did." And he responds, "Precisely, and they are that which we know." So I think that is kind of the takeaway point of at least this sculpture, if not the avant-garde as a whole. I'm excited for your questions about any of this, so we will turn to those next.